Okay, welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video I'm going to be talking about DM, GM strengths and weaknesses. This is a video response to Tim Harper. I'm going to start with what I consider to be my weaknesses so that I can end on a positive point. I would say that my first weakness is that I often get very frustrated when real life issues or scheduling conflicts interfere with the running of a game, whether I'm playing or whether I'm GMing it. Now obviously I appreciate that real life issues do have to take precedence over a game. Nevertheless, it can still be very disheartening when you put a lot of effort into preparing a game and getting everyone together, and then that just doesn't really pan out for one reason or another. I generally find it easier to run campaigns than one-offs, and this is purely because when I started GMing, that was what I thought role-playing was. I thought that all role-playing games were a campaign. The one-off game, the quick pick-up session, wasn't as prevalent, certainly in the environment that I started role-playing in back then. Although I have been working on that, and I've run a few reasonably successful one-offs online and face-to-face, and they all seem to be going quite well. And that's certainly something I'm enjoying more and more as I get used to it. I quite often find that I get burnt out on games when they don't really seem to be progressing anywhere, or I feel that a game isn't living up to the standards I want. And that's normally no criticism of the players, it's normally me being overly self-critical of my own GMing style, but I can often become frustrated, and I tend to prefer to move on to what I think may be a better idea and sort of slog through something that I think really isn't going anywhere. Although I've been working to combat this by running games that are less open-ended, games that, even if they are campaign games, have a finite endpoint, and that certainly seems to be helping a little. I do find one of the things very frustrating in role-playing nowadays, as I've got older, that I no longer have as much time to prep or plan as I used to, and I'm sure that most people will find that as more and more real-life things interfere, family, homes, jobs, etc., that this naturally becomes the case. However, again, with part of being my own worst critic, I tend to find that it really does frustrate me not being able to devote what I consider to be an appropriate amount of prep or planning time to a game. Another thing I find frustrating is players who are very reactive. I like to think I'm a fairly proactive player myself. If I'm presented with a scenario, I can just run with that. That's absolutely fine. I've always been able to do that. I don't mind if someone's a little bit hesitant at the start of a game. That's only natural. I think that a lot of people need a little bit of help to be drawn into a game. That's absolutely fine. I'm more than happy to do that as a GM. I like to think that I'd extend a sort of a helping hand to anyone who was struggling in a game, or I'd at least ask them if they are happy taking a more of a backseat role. If they are, great. If not, then I'd try and work out ways with them that we could bring them more into the game. It's when people really just don't seem to try or seem to actually enjoy the role play element of an RPG that I find it slightly bewildering and frustrating. Another thing I'm not particularly good at is the fact that I've never really run a convention game, to be honest. In fact, I've only really been to one roleplay convention, which was a London Gen Con way back in the mists of time. We had an unfortunate accident at the start of it where my wife ended up in hospital, so it wasn't quite the relaxing gaming experience we'd hoped for, and I've never really been to one since. I was hoping to go to the UK Expo this year, but unfortunately that's not really panned out. I'm hoping I'll be able to go for next year, playing a few games, and then maybe in a year or two look at actually running some there myself. From the people like Tim, who run a lot of games in conventions, they seem to see it as a very positive experience. So maybe I'd like to give that a go in the future. It's not something I have any experience of at the moment, though. And I'd say my final weakness really is that my tolerance and my sort of ability to be bothered learning complex new rule systems has just dwindled and dropped off massively as time goes on. There's a lot of systems that I learned, World of Darkness, some of the GURPS stuff, a few other systems I could think of, D&D for instance, that I learnt when I was younger, that to be honest, if I was going to be looking at them now, I probably wouldn't go to the effort of learning those systems. It's nothing against anyone who enjoys them, absolutely fine. And as I say, since I learnt them when I was younger, I still enjoy them myself. I'm still familiar with them. However, I find now that I just find, for me personally, that very complicated rule systems for me just get in the way of the story, and I'd rather just have some simple rules that I can pick up, just run with, even as a GM or a player, and the group can just get together, get on with enjoying playing their characters and constructing that group narrative between the GM and the players, rather than having to spend ages with people going, oh, what modifier do I roll for combat? How does this level 3 fire throwing power work? How does this work? I just haven't got any time for that at all, to be perfectly honest. So to move on to what I consider to be my strengths. First of all, I would say that I'm quite happy to improvise and run with suggestions from players. I love it when players suggest things to me. I want them to be proactive, and I try and encourage this as much as possible. I want them to be involved in the creation of the group story, the narrative. I want them to almost have as much of a hand in it as myself. If not as much, maybe even more, who knows. I think that everyone in the game, whether GM or player, should feel that they have contributed something to the world, to the setting, and to the narrative that has unfolded in the game. After all, a large part of the fun, certainly for me, when it comes to role-playing, is taking something that's in your mind, sharing it with other people, letting them bounce ideas off it, and coming up with something that is far greater than the sum of its parts. That's the real beauty of role-playing games to me. And I like to try and encourage that in players. I like to think I'm fairly good at representing NPCs and creating interesting scenes. It always makes me smile when I hear people, I've got players who talk about scenes that I've had in games I've run years before, and that always makes me smile. It's always good to know that things like that have stuck in your player's mind. I would say that my final strength is I'm generally willing to run with almost any concept of a game, no matter how ridiculous or weird it may seem. I always think that there's some good in practically every concept. For instance, the Grand Theft Cthulhu game I ran, which was online, simply came about because I was trying to introduce a player to role-playing who wasn't familiar with it, but was a big fan of computer games, and I knew loved the Grand Theft Auto games, and I'm a big fan of the Cthulhu mythos. Jam them both together, and we all had a really enjoyable one-off session. So that's a few of my strengths and weaknesses. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, you'll click on like and subscribe. Maybe even put up your own video response saying what are some of your GM's strengths and weaknesses. Well, this has been the Red Dice Diaries. If you've got anything to say on this subject, or if you want to link me to your video responses, please either put them in the comments box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. And until I see you next time, thank you very much for watching and for listening. Take care.